How did the world's greatest city fall in one night? Every empire since has collapsed the same way, including yours. Walls 80 feet thick, a river for a moat, an army inside, Babylon fell anyway, in darkness, without a battle. Stay. You'll see exactly how Cyrus walked through. Belshazzar's banquet was still roaring when the hand appeared. Not a man's hand, just a hand suspended in torchlight, writing on the plaster wall of the palace. 1,000 nobles watched the fingers move. The wine cups stopped. The music stopped. The greatest city on earth went quiet. Somewhere beneath the city, soldiers were already wading through cold river water in the dark. They were moving under the walls. Babylon did not know. By the time the first Persian blade caught torchlight inside the palace, the empire of 6 centuries was already over. It had taken one night. Babylon was not simply a powerful city. It was the center around which the entire ancient world organized itself. Its laws, its gods, its idea of what civilization even meant. Its walls were so thick that 2 chariots could race side by side along the top. Its granaries held food for decades. 32 trading kingdoms fed wealth into it every year. When Babylon fell, it did not just end a dynasty. It erased the gravitational center of the known world, and every civilization that came after has been orbiting that absence ever since, including ours. Every empire that has collapsed since, Rome, Constantinople, the British Order, has followed the same pattern Babylon wrote first: a city too large to imagine falling, gone without a siege. The walls were unbroken, the army was intact, the granaries were full. Cyrus the Great had no weapon that should have worked against a city like this. The ancient chronicles record the fall of Babylon in 2 words: without battle. 1,500 years of military history, and they offer 2 words. The greatest city in the world was not conquered by an enemy. Something stranger happened, something that the military record alone cannot explain. What you are about to understand is not just how one city died in a single night, but the precise mechanism by which every invincible thing eventually destroys itself from within. That mechanism is older than Babylon. It is running right now, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. This is the fall of Babylon, the night the ancient world's most powerful city collapsed, and why it was already over long before the soldiers arrived. The year was 539 BC. The largest army the ancient world had assembled was already moving through the dark. Cyrus the Great had not come to negotiate. He had come to end something, and the strangest part is that Babylon had already agreed to let him. Inside the city, King Nabonidus stood at the gates he had abandoned for 10 years. He had retreated to the desert oasis of Tema, leaving his son Belshazzar to hold Babylon in his name. Now, with the Persians camped on the far bank of the Euphrates, he had returned. He walked the processional way in silence. The priests did not come out to meet him. A clay cylinder, no larger than a man's fist, fired in the kilns of Babylon itself. The Cyrus Cylinder, inscribed in Akkadian cuneiform, recovered from the ruins in 1879. It tells the story of what happened that night in the conqueror's own words. Or rather, in the words he wished history to remember. Those are not always the same thing. Babylon was not simply a city. It was the axis around which the ancient world turned, its walls so wide that 2 chariots could race abreast along the top. Its population, perhaps 200,000 souls, the largest gathering of human beings on Earth. It had stood for 1,500 years. Empires had risen and rotted away in the span of its existence, and yet, in a single night, without a siege, without a battle, it was gone. To understand what happened in October of 539 BC, you must first understand what Babylon believed about itself. It believed it was eternal, protected by Marduk, the king of gods, whose golden statue stood 60 feet high at the heart of the great ziggurat. No foreign king had ever held this city. No god had ever turned away from it. That belief was the real wall, and it had already developed a crack. The Persian army arrived at the banks of the Euphrates in late summer. Cyrus had already taken the Lydians, already absorbed the Medes. His empire ran from the Aegean coast to the borders of India. Babylon was the last great prize. His generals surveyed the fortifications and filed their reports. The walls were 80 meters thick at the base. A battering ram would splinter before it left a mark. The walls could not be broken. The granaries held years of food. Something else had to give. Nabonidus was a man who had chosen the wrong god, a scholar king obsessed with antiquity, with dust and forgotten cults. He had elevated Sin, the moon god, above Marduk, the supreme deity of Babylon. His priests called him the heretic. His generals called him absent. And for 10 years, he had canceled the Akitu, the sacred New Year festival through which the king renewed his covenant with Marduk each spring. To the priesthood, this was not neglect. It was severance. The priests of Marduk had sent envoys. We do not know what was said in those meetings, but the ancient texts suggest that contact had been made between the temple hierarchy of Babylon and the camp of Cyrus the Great. The chronicles tell us that Marduk himself was searching for a righteous king, that he had grown tired of waiting inside these walls, and that he had already found his answer in the Persian camp across the river. The greatest city in the world was not betrayed by an enemy. It was abandoned by its own gods. The Euphrates River ran through the heart of Babylon, its lifeline, and, as Cyrus's engineers recognized after weeks of cold study, its single fatal weakness. The river entered the city through massive bronze water gates set into the northern and southern walls. Gates that dropped below the waterline. Gates that, if the river's depth could be sufficiently reduced, would hang useless above the level of a soldier's chest. An army could wade in under them, in darkness, without a sound. Herodotus tells us that Cyrus ordered a vast network of canals constructed upstream, diverting the Euphrates away from the city. Thousands of workers, moving earth in silence across months of preparation. The river that had sheltered Babylon for a millennium was turned like a weapon in a new hand. When the night came, the Euphrates ran shallow as a cattle ford. The bronze gates, built to stop armies, hung in open air. The Nabonidus Chronicle, a Babylonian administrative record, confirms the date, the 14th day of Tashritu, October the 12th by our reckoning. The entry is brief, almost bureaucratic in its stillness. The Persian troops entered the city of Babylon without battle. No arrows, no siege, no burning. Without battle, 2 words, 1,500 years, and the Chronicle offers 2 words. The soldiers of Cyrus waded the shallowed river in darkness. They passed beneath the bronze water gates, those vast barriers built to stop any army, now hanging above the level of men's chests. They moved in silence along the riverbanks inside the city, taking the inner defensive posts before the guards could sound an alarm. The army was inside Babylon before Babylon understood it was under attack. And here, the record confronts us with its strangest silence. That same night, while the armies moved through the riverside streets, a feast was being held in the palace. The book of Daniel describes Belshazzar hosting a banquet for 1,000 of his lords. Wine flowing, music playing. The golden vessels of Solomon's temple, looted from Jerusalem 60 years before, used as drinking cups. The city did not know it was ending. Belshazzar, son of Nabonidus, though Daniel calls him son of Nebuchadnezzar, a theological claim, not a genealogical one. He had held the city in his father's name for a decade. He was a capable administrator, a practiced military mind. The fact that he held a feast that night tells us something close to unbearable. He believed the walls would hold. His generals had assured him. No army had ever entered this city. He had believed them. Then the hand appeared. Daniel writes that a human hand emerged from empty air and wrote upon the plastered wall of the banqueting hall. 4 words in a script none of the Babylonian wise men could read. Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. The king's face drained of color. His knees went. His lords fell silent over their cups. Even if you read this as metaphor, something broke in that room that night. Some certainty that had held for a decade and would not hold another hour. Men, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Upharsin, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians, whether scratched by a disembodied hand or carried as a whisper through palace corridors as the first sounds of soldiers reached the outer gates. The sentence was identical either way. Numbered, weighed, divided. There are historians who believe none of this happened, and historians who believe all of it did. The city still fell. By the time word reached the palace that Persian soldiers were inside the walls, it was already too late. The riverside districts had been secured without resistance. The inner city gates, cedar doors faced in bronze, were opened from within. Some accounts suggest the garrison surrendered outright. Others describe a brief, sharp fight at the palace precinct itself. But the outcome was not in question. Babylon's outer walls, its pride, its theology, its promise of eternal safety, had meant nothing at all. The Nabonidus Chronicle records that Ugbaru, the Persian general commanding the vanguard, entered without any battle. The soldiers' weapons were sheathed. Cyrus had issued explicit orders: no looting, no burning, no desecration of temples. This was not conquest in the Assyrian tradition, the tradition of flayed skins and burning cities. This was something Cyrus had studied and chosen deliberately. Not the power that people fear, the power that people consent to. Belshazzar was killed that night. The chronicles are parsimonious with detail. Daniel says it plainly. That very night, Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain. No elaborate scene, no recorded last words. He simply ends, a parenthesis in a chapter whose first line had been written before he was born. 17 days later, Cyrus himself entered the city. The Nabonidus Chronicle records the scene with precision. Green branches were spread before him in the streets. The priests of Marduk, those same priests who had seethed for a decade under Nabonidus, welcomed the Persian king as the chosen of their god. The population did not resist. In many accounts, they cheered. A foreign king, speaking a foreign language, walking through a city of 200,000 people who were glad to see him. A city of 200,000 people, and its conqueror walked in to applause. Sit with that. Cyrus the Great, born around 600 BC into a minor Persian dynasty. By the time he stood inside the gates of Babylon, he commanded the largest empire the world had yet produced. Every account that survives points to the same quality: a mind that understood something most conquerors never grasped. That the most durable form of power is not the kind people fear, but the kind people reach toward and choose of their own will to accept. The Cyrus Cylinder, written in the months after the conquest, is his masterpiece of political theater. It declares that Marduk had chosen Cyrus as king, that Cyrus had restored the temples, that he had freed the captive peoples from their bondage. Scholars debate how much of this was genuine conviction and how much was precision-crafted propaganda. The answer may be that for Cyrus, the distinction was meaningless. He had found that belief and utility, aimed at the same target, become indistinguishable. Among the captive peoples Cyrus freed were the Jews, exiled to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar 60 years before. The Hebrew Bible names him the Anointed One, the Shepherd of God. Isaiah names him by name, a prophecy written, some scholars argue, generations before Cyrus was born. Whether that dating holds or not, the gesture remade a people. Cyrus allowed the Jews to return to Jerusalem, to rebuild their temple, to carry back the sacred vessels that Belshazzar had been drinking from on the last night of Babylon. The cups from Solomon's temple, raised in triumph on Babylon's last night, became the vessels of a homecoming. History does this sometimes. But what actually destroyed Babylon? Not the Persians, who preserved it, who made it a capital of their empire for generations. The city they entered in 539 BC continued to exist, populated and functioning, for 3 centuries more. The fall of Babylon was not the fall of a place. It was the death of a center. The last moment when Babylon was the point around which human civilization organized itself, the source of law, of gods, of time itself. Consider the scale of what that center had produced. Hammurabi's legal code, carved in black diorite, the first written law to govern the lives of ordinary people, astronomical tables that tracked planetary motion across centuries with a precision not matched in Europe for 1,000 years. A mathematical system, base 60, that we still use today every time we read a clock face. Gilgamesh, the oldest story in human hands. Babylon was not a powerful city. It was the library in which the ancient world had stored its mind. Nabonidus was captured, not killed. Cyrus, with his characteristic economy of cruelty, spared him and sent him to comfortable exile in the eastern provinces. He lived out his remaining years in Carmania, in what is now southern Iran. The last king of Babylon died as a provincial curiosity, speaking Akkadian to attendants who could not understand him, worshipping gods whose temples had already been repurposed for other uses, dreaming, perhaps, of the oasis at Taima. The question that haunts every historian of this period is not how Babylon fell, but why it surrendered so completely. The walls were intact, the granaries full, the army still capable of a fight, and yet something had emptied the city of its will from the inside. Something that Cyrus had read and understood, and Nabonidus had never once noticed. An empire is not its walls. It is a belief held by the people inside them. And the belief had been dying in Babylon for 10 years before a single Persian touched the river. Empires do not fall from the outside. They are abandoned from within. The Babylonian priestly class had been severing from Nabonidus for years before the Persians arrived. His devotion to the moon god Sin, a regional cult, provincial in the priest's estimation, was a daily insult to the supremacy of Marduk. Worse, he had transported the sacred statues of Marduk and lesser gods from their home temples to Babylon, claiming it was for their protection. The priests read it differently. The gods were hostages. Their own king had taken their gods hostage. When Cyrus arrived and declared that he was restoring Marduk's honor, returning the sacred statues to their proper temples, reviving the Akitu festival, re-establishing the ancient rites, the priestly class embraced him with a fervor that fear alone cannot produce. They genuinely preferred him. A foreign king, raised in a foreign tongue, was more legitimate in their eyes than the man who had sat on the throne of Babylon for 20 years. That is what the collapse of a civilization's interior looks like. The merchants had their own ledger of grievances. Trade routes had frayed under years of political instability. Nabonidus's monetary reforms had corroded the temple banking system that underwrote commerce across the entire Near East. The Persian Empire offered what Babylon's traders had not had in a decade: certainty. A vast, administered network of roads and ports stretching from Egypt to India. Silver that moved. Contracts that held. The merchants did not mourn the old order. They were already pricing goods in the new one. Cyrus did not conquer Babylon. He inherited a city that had already chosen him and simply arrived. And yet, we must resist accepting Cyrus's own account too completely. The Cyrus Cylinder is propaganda, masterfully constructed, historically consequential, genuinely revolutionary in its language of human rights, and also a document of deliberate political fiction. He did not free all peoples. He did not restore all temples. He absorbed Babylon's land, its grain surpluses, its artisans and administrators, into his own machinery of empire. The liberation was real, and it had a boundary. As liberations always do, the clay tablets of Babylon, thousands recovered from the dry soil of Iraq, tell the story beneath the official one. Tax records, contracts, land transfers. The Persians were methodical administrators. Babylonian land passed into Persian hands. Babylonian silver moved east. The temple estates, those vast agricultural networks that had sustained the priestly class for centuries, were folded into the imperial accounting system within a generation. The liberation did not appear in the ledgers. By 500 BC, within 40 years of the conquest, Babylon was still a city, still inhabited, still magnificent in its bones. But it was no longer sovereign. Its laws were made in Persepolis. Its taxes left and did not return. Its gods were tolerated, not supreme. The ziggurat of Marduk, Etemenenki, the tower that may have given the Bible its image of Babel, was crumbling at the edges, its rituals performed by an aging priesthood whose numbers grew thinner every year. In 482 BC, Babylon rebelled, not once, but twice. The Babylonians rose against the Persian king Xerxes, the same Xerxes who would send his armies into Greece within the year. He broke both revolts with a violence Cyrus had never permitted himself. The walls were demolished. Those walls, 80 meters at the base, that no army had ever breached. The statue of Marduk was melted down for its metal. The sacred compact between a god and a people, the covenant at the center of Babylonian existence, was unmade deliberately and for good. What Cyrus had taken peacefully, Xerxes made certain could never wake again. Alexander the Great arrived in 331 BC and found a city still breathing, still populated, still carrying its history in its brickwork. He announced he would restore Etemenenki. He ordered 10,000 workers to begin clearing the rubble that had accumulated around the ziggurat's base. A vast undertaking, measured in months of labor. And then Alexander died in the palace nearby, at 32, of a fever or a poison or both. The workers stopped. The rubble was never cleared. The tower was never rebuilt. After Alexander, the slow dissolution. His successors built a new city nearby, Seleucia on the Tigris, and Babylon's population drained toward it, household by household, across a century of quiet attrition. Priests continued performing rites that fewer and fewer of the living could understand. The last dated cuneiform tablet recovered from Babylon is from 75 AD, 1,000 years after the city's founding, and a faint residue of what it had been. A scribe, recording something, in a language the city around him no longer spoke. By the 2nd century AD, where the greatest city in the world had stood, there was silence. Sand over the Ishtar gate, wind through the ruins of the palace where Belshazzar had raised his cup, shepherds grazing flocks across the foundations of Etemenanki with no knowledge of what lay beneath their feet. Everything that Babylon had built, its law, its mathematics, its astronomy, its poetry, had passed into other tongues, other cities, other civilizations that forgot where the inheritance came from. The ideas survived. The city did not. Every civilization believes itself eternal. Perhaps this is the only belief they have ever all shared. The question the fall of Babylon places before us, the question history never fully answers, is whether any of it was inevitable. If Nabonidus had kept the Akitu festival, if the priests had held, if the river had run deep that October night. Historians call these the contingencies, the hinge moments where the smallest adjustment might have sent everything down a different corridor. What the evidence will not tell us is whether those corridors lead anywhere different, or whether this was always where the corridor ended. Cyrus the Great died 8 years after his conquest of Babylon in 530 BC, fighting nomadic tribes on the eastern frontier. He was buried in a plain stone tomb at Pasargadae in the Persian heartland. The inscription above the entrance, preserved by Greek historians centuries later, reads, "O man, whoever you are and wherever you come from, for I know that you will come. I am Cyrus, who gave the Persians their empire. Do not begrudge me this little earth that covers my body." The Euphrates still runs through Iraq, narrower now, dammed, diverted, diminished by 100 modern interventions. The Mound of Babel, the Arabic rendering of Babylon, rises 50 feet above the plain near the city of Hilla. Beneath it, archaeologists have found the foundations of the processional way, the blue-glazed bricks of the Ishtar Gate, the ghost of a courtyard where 200,000 people once lived their lives, entirely certain that what surrounded them would stand long after they were gone. No cylinder, no chronicle, no clay tablet answers the question we are left with at the edge of that mound, in the Iraqi heat. Not how Babylon fell, but what we will do, knowing that it did.